Our topic for the notes today is slavery and the Civil War. We know that slavery was an important cause of the war, especially the issue of the expansion of slavery. And so once the war breaks out between the North and the South, you had abolitionist groups in the North that began to put a lot of pressure on President Lincoln to end slavery. I think from their perspective, they looked at it as the war's already started, and so we should just go ahead and end slavery. We don't have to worry about it causing a war. The war's already on. But Lincoln held off for a couple reasons. One, there were still 5 states in the Union, those border states, that had slavery. And he didn't want to lose those slave states, especially the state of Maryland. D.C., Washington, D.C., is surrounded by the state of Maryland. And so if Maryland were to break away and join the South, the Northern government, the Union government, would have to abandon Washington, D.C. So Lincoln doesn't want that to happen. He also doesn't want to lose the other border states. Lincoln also didn't want to look desperate. In the first couple years of the war, Lincoln knew that things weren't going all that great for the Union. They had lost a lot of battles. They weren't doing a great job with the Anaconda Plan, and he didn't want to look desperate. He certainly was not a fan of slavery, but hesitated to end it because he thought it might make the North look like it was a last-ditch effort, that they were only doing it because they couldn't win the war, and so he didn't want that to be the case. So what Lincoln decides to do to address these issues is to wait until after the Battle of Antietam to release an order about slavery. And he does do this after Antietam. He issues the famous Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation Proclamation. In a nutshell, it said that on January 1st, 1863, all slaves in areas that were still rebelling would be free. So Lincoln was very careful to make sure that this only applied to states that were rebelling against the Union. So that meant the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, that had slavery would not be affected by this. So if a state stopped rebelling, if any of the southern states stopped rebelling and came back and joined the Union, their owners would be allowed to keep their slaves. So Lincoln tried to give an incentive for some of those states to come back. As I said, slave owners in the border states like Maryland were allowed to keep their slaves. Slave owners in places that had already been conquered by the Union Army kept their slaves. And this was designed to encourage the South to give up, right? Say, okay, well, if we were to give up and go back to the Union, then we could keep slavery. And it also was designed to tie the war effort to ending slavery for the North. So Lincoln, in doing the Emancipation Proclamation, issuing this order, achieves a couple goals. As I said, it made Northern abolitionists happy because it made ending slavery one of the goals of the war. It kept the border states from leaving the Union. And in Lincoln's eyes, it gave the South a reason to give up, that they could keep slavery if they gave up and came back to the Union. Well, no southern states take him up on his offer. None of the Confederacy states of the Confederacy came back to the Union. So the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. So what that meant was anywhere the Union Army took over, right, they would free slaves. And so some slaves ran away to join the Union Army. And some slaves that ran away and joined the Army or were freed by the Army actually stayed with the Army and were given paying jobs to help. They kind of worked in the camps and did some different jobs in the camps. And some of those slaves or former slaves were paid. Another important impact of the Emancipation Proclamation was that the North actually began to recruit African American soldiers for the war effort. They were typically put into all-black regiments. They weren't integrated into white regiments, but they were brought into the Union Army to take part in the war effort. These black soldiers did receive less pay than white soldiers. So there was still some of that racism and discrimination, but in terms of the war effort, the Emancipation Proclamation did make it an important goal for the North to end slavery.